Let me just bring you some breaking news concerning the WhatsApp messages of the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, which have been requested by the inquiry looking into the COVID pandemic and the government's handling of it. We understand in a statement that's just been released that all of Boris Johnson's material, including WhatsApps and notebooks that have been requested by the COVID inquiry, has been handed now to the Cabinet Office in full and in unredacted form. The statement that's been released goes on to say Mr Johnson urges the Cabinet Office to urgently disclose it to the inquiry. And now the Cabinet Office, they say, has had access to this material for several months. Mr Johnson would immediately disclose it directly to the inquiry if asked. The statement goes on, while Mr Johnson understands that the government's position and doesn't seek to contradict it, he is perfectly happy for the inquiry to have access to this material in whatever form it takes. So let's get more on this breaking news now and this issue of Boris Johnson's WhatsApp messages. We can cross to Westminster and speak to our chief political correspondent, John Craig. And John, there has been this call from this COVID inquiry for these WhatsApp messages. The deadline was yesterday, then it was extended till tomorrow. So get us up to date with the very latest then, and what the statement tells us.
Well, this is a very significant breakthrough because it's broken the deadlock, really, and the standoff between the Baroness Hallett, Lady Hallett, the retired appeal court judge, and the government in particular, and also Boris Johnson, over the handing over of all this material that she wants for the inquiry. Primarily, a lot of diary entries and WhatsApp messages. Now, there was the battle between the Cabinet Office in particular and Lady Hallett had looked as though it was heading for the courts and a legal battle. Now, Mr Johnson here has said, look, it's not me that's holding things up, it's the government, with this dramatic statement in the last few minutes. He says that all his material, WhatsApps, notebooks requested by the inquiry have been handed to the Cabinet Office in full, and in unredacted form. Now, this really is putting a challenge to the Cabinet Office, to the Prime Minister and other senior government ministers to hand them over to Baroness Hallett exactly as they are. Now, he goes on to say that he urges the Cabinet Office to disclose them to the inquiry. So this is Boris Johnson really catching the Cabinet Office a bit off guard, probably. The last development we had late last night, or during the course of the evening, certainly, was the Cabinet Office in a very hard-hitting statement saying, no, we are not going to hand over all the WhatsApps and diary entries because a lot of them are, as they put it, irrelevant and contain the private lives of many government staff, officials and employees. Government employees are entitled to a private life, the Cabinet Office said in its statement. So, Mr Johnson is saying that the Cabinet Office has had access to this material for several months, not just a few weeks or so, several months. So this is really Mr Johnson throwing down a challenge to Rishi Sunak and indeed Oliver Dowden, who is the minister in charge of the Cabinet Office. He said, and he also, in a challenge to the government, has said this: he would immediately disclose his material directly to the inquiry if asked. So the ball really is in the government's court now, because Boris Johnson has moved swiftly ahead of the next deadline, the 4 p.m. deadline tomorrow, to assist the inquiry and, you might say, embarrass Rishi Sunak and the government.